Seraphine Voss had spent most of her life being overlooked, and she had made her peace with it. She was not the daughter of a high alpha. She did not carry a powerful bloodline, or a name that made rooms go quiet when it was spoken. She was Omega-born, third daughter of the Voss family, a line so far down the pack hierarchy that their family crest appeared in exactly 2 official records, 1 birth register and 1 taxation scroll, from 4 decades ago. Her mother hemmed the same 3 dresses in rotation. Her father shook hands with men who forgot his name before they reached the door. Seraphine knew what she was. She had known since she was 9 years old, and a high-pack girl at the temple school had looked at her crest pin and said, with genuine curiosity and zero malice, "Oh, is that a real family?" She had smiled and said yes, and gone home, and sat in the yard for a long time, watching the sky do nothing. She was good at sitting with things, good at carrying weight without showing the shape of it. She had a sense of humor that lived mostly inside her own head, dry and quiet. The kind that made her shoulders shake when she was alone, but rarely made it out into the world where people could misunderstand it. She was 22 years old, and she had never once asked a room to notice her, which made what happened at the Harvest Moon ceremony particularly inconvenient. She had been summoned to the Ashveil Citadel because the 7-pack charter required Omega representation at the Alpha King's binding ceremony. Someone from every registered bloodline had to attend. It was law. Old, mostly ceremonial law, the kind written in a century when such things mattered, for reasons nobody fully remembered anymore, but law regardless. She traveled 2 days by coach with the Northern Omega delegate, a cheerful older man named Petter, who talked about his grandchildren for approximately 16 hours, and offered her dried apricots every 40 minutes. She arrived at the Citadel with a borrowed traveling cloak, a dress her mother had hemmed the night before, with the specific focused love of a woman who knows she cannot give her daughter more than this, and absolutely no expectations. She had not come to be seen. She had come because she was told to come. She planned to sit in her assigned gallery seat, witness the binding of the Alpha King to Isolde Ferna of the Eastern High Pack, eat whatever food was provided afterward, sleep in whatever room was assigned, and be on a coach home by morning. That was the plan. The plan lasted until the Binding Bough refused to bloom. The ceremony was exactly as grand as she had expected. More marble than any building needed, more candles than any room required, a ceiling so high above her that the light from below did not quite reach it, and the upper dark felt like a held breath. The 7-pack alphas sat in curved rows, the delegates filled the galleries. The high priest stood at the altar with the Binding Bough, a branch from the moon tree, silver white and ancient, held in both hands like something breakable. Isolde Ferna was everything Seraphine was not. Tall, composed, draped in Eastern silk that probably cost more than the Voss family's annual grain supply, with the particular confidence of a woman who had been told since birth that she was precisely the right shape for the world she lived in. She was stunning. The crowd loved her. She ascended the dais with the grace of someone who had practiced ascending things her entire life. King Caelan Ashveil was already waiting. Seraphine had heard stories about him, of course. Everyone had heard stories. 7 years on the throne, consolidated the northern and southern territories in one treaty that should have taken a decade. Cold, they said. Precise. A man who made decisions the way other men made calculations, without sentiment, without hesitation, without the small human pause that most people needed before they did something irreversible. Looking at him now, she thought the stories were accurate but incomplete. He was all of that. He was also something else, something still and dense and serious, the way very old trees were serious, the way stone was serious after centuries of weather. He stood at the altar and the room arranged itself around him without his doing anything to cause it. She pressed her palm flat against her collarbone. There was a pull there, faint, strange, like a compass needle, responding to something it had no name for. She told herself it was nerves, the grandeur of the hall, the long coach ride, the apricots. The high priest raised the bough over Isolde Ferna. It did not bloom. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a very large room full of people, all deciding at the same time not to speak. The high priest waited, lowered the bough, raised it again. The flowers did not come. A whisper moved through the galleries like wind through tall grass. By law. The old law, the real law, the kind carved into the temple foundation stones before the citadel existed. When the bough refused a chosen mate, the bond call had to be opened to the full assembly. Every unmated wolf in the room was required to step forward. The bough would find the true match, or it would find nothing, and if it found nothing, the king would wait another lunar year. Seraphine's neighbor in the gallery, a round-faced woman from the western borderlands, elbowed her. She stood up. She stood up the way people stand up at the end of long meetings, when everyone is waiting for someone else to move first. She stood up expecting nothing, because nothing had ever been the appropriate expectation. The high priest walked the line of delegates slowly. The bough moved from person to person. Dark, still, silent. He reached Seraphine. The bough bloomed. 6 white flowers, opening one after another in the time it takes to breathe twice, extravagant and unhurried, and completely, humiliatingly certain. She stared at them. The hall went so quiet she could hear the candles. Caelan Ashveil turned from the altar and looked at her. She felt the weight of his attention like weather. Not cruel, not kind, just present and unavoidable, the way weather always was. She watched him look at her borrowed cloak, her faded crest, her face, which was nobody's idea of a political alliance. He descended the dais. He crossed the floor. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Fast, thorough, and ending somewhere she could already read. He took the blooming bough from the priest's hands and placed it in hers. That was the gesture of acknowledgement. That was what the law said happened next. Then he said, quietly, and evenly, and without cruelty, which somehow made it worse, "I reject this bond." He placed the bough in her hands and rejected the bond in the same motion, which was either the most efficient thing she had ever witnessed, or the coldest, and she was not sure there was a difference. He turned and walked back to the dais. The flowers in her hands kept blooming. That was the part nobody spoke about afterward. The bough did not go dark. It did not curl back into itself, or drop its petals, or perform any of the dignified withdrawals she might have hoped for. It simply continued doing what it was doing, which was blooming with complete indifference to the opinions of kings. She stood there for a moment, with 6 white flowers opening in her hands, in front of the assembled 7 packs. Then she set the bough carefully on her chair. She walked out. She did not cry until she reached the outer courtyard, and even then it was brief. 4 seconds, maybe 5. The body's involuntary response to something landing in a place she hadn't known she kept things. Then it stopped, and she put her back against a cold stone wall, and looked up at the harvest moon, and took one long breath. All right, here is where we are. Here is what is true. She was 2 days from home. She had no political standing to fight anything. The rejection was legal. She was going to go back to the Voss territories, and she was going to tell her mother it was fine, and then she was going to go sit in the yard and look at the sky doing nothing. And in a week this would be the strangest story she owned, but it would only be a story. She was halfway across the courtyard with all of this, decided when the footsteps came. 2 sets. Fast. She did not run. The king's beta, Davan. She had been told his name in the pre-ceremony briefing, a broad and careful man who looked like he had spent years being calm on behalf of people who could not afford to be, and behind him, a woman in white robes who moved with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who already knew the outcome. "The king requests you remain in the citadel," Davan said, "pending formal dissolution of the—" "No. It is a formality. It is a building he controls, and I have no rank in." She was very calm. She was surprised by how calm she was. "Tell him the rejection was received. Tell him I release whatever claim the law assigned. Put it in writing. Seal it. Done. I'm going home." The woman in white had not spoken. She was watching Seraphine with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite sorrow, and lived somewhere in the space between those two things. "Who are you?" Seraphine asked. "A messenger," the woman said, "from Celine." The courtyard was very still. "She says," the woman continued, in the same quiet tone, "that you have been carrying it long enough. She says let them see." The pain started before the words were fully out. Not sharp, more like something that had been compressed for a very long time, was gently, firmly beginning to expand. Her left shoulder. She reached up without thinking and found raised skin beneath her fingers, warm and unmistakable. She turned to find a reflection, a bronze decorative shield on the citadel wall, tarnished and uneven, gave her a rough image of herself. On her left shoulder, silver white and absolutely clear, the mark of Selene. Not the small crescent that bonded wolves carried, not the simple half-moon of a mated pair, something older, something she had only ever seen in temple murals, painted in colors so faded the archivists argued about what they had originally been. A full interlocking symbol that took up the width of her shoulder and moved slightly in the bronze reflection, as though it was still settling into place. The mark of the Luna Queen, the title empty for 300 years. The woman in white watched her take this in. Then she added, with a lightness that seemed deliberately chosen, "She also says to tell the king that he has approximately 3 hours to understand his mistake before the consequences become difficult to manage." Seraphine stood in the cold courtyard with her hand on her shoulder and her reflection in a tarnished shield and the harvest moon above her. She started laughing. Not because anything was funny. Because there was a particular feeling that came when you had been right about something for your entire life without ever having the language for it, when you had carried a sense of your own depth in a world that kept handing you shallow containers. And finally, in the least expected courtyard, at the least expected moment, the language arrived. She laughed until it was done. Then she straightened. She asked for a room inside the citadel. She was given one significantly better than the gallery delegate quarters she had been assigned. No one mentioned the difference. She did not mention it either. The summons came before sunrise. The 7-pack alphas had convened in the council chamber. The high priest was present. Devon stood at the door with the expression of a man managing his face very carefully. Seraphine wore a dress borrowed from the citadel attendants, one that left her marked shoulder bare, not as a statement, not as theater, but because covering it now would be a kind of dishonesty she was not willing to perform. The law, when the high priest read it aloud, was simple in the way that very old and very serious things were simple. The Luna Queen's mark was not a suggestion from the moon goddess. It was not a celestial preference to be weighed against political convenience. It was a designation, an office. A correction applied to whatever arrangement currently existed. Caelan stood across the chamber. She had not looked at him when she entered. She looked at him now. He saw the mark. She watched something move through him. Not a small thing. Not something that had an easy name. It moved through him and he held it, and she could see the exact cost of holding it, and she felt something she had not expected to feel about him, which was a kind of recognition. She knew what it looked like when a person was carrying weight without showing the shape of it. She knew it very well. Old Marin of the Northern Range, 80 years old, 6 binding ceremonies attended, 3 of her own political crises survived, looked at Caelan over the rim of her council chair, with the expression of a woman watching someone step in something and calculating how long it will take them to notice. "Well," Marin said, and left it there. The formal acknowledgement took an hour. The legal dissolution of the previous proceedings took another. Isolde Farron, handled with genuine care by the Eastern Alpha representatives, was quietly and respectfully directed toward a match that suited her better, and that she accepted, with the composure of a woman who had suspected for some time that this was not where she belonged. Throughout it all, Seraphine stood in the council chamber and did not offer anyone anything, not reassurance, not grace, not the particular softness that women in her position were often expected to produce to make the people around them more comfortable. She was done producing comfort for rooms that had not earned it. Weeks passed. The political machinery of the 7-packs did what political machinery always did. It ground, and it reshaped, and eventually it produced a new arrangement that everyone could live with, and then it moved on. Seraphine and Caelan did not have an easy beginning. They had a true one, which was different and harder and more worthwhile. He was not a man who apologized with words. He apologized with consistency, with attention, with the slow and deliberate practice of seeing her accurately. She was not a woman who forgave through feeling. She forgave through evidence, through watching him choose correctly, over and over, until the pattern meant something. It took time. Most real things did. One evening she found the bough. Someone had placed it in a water glass on the windowsill of her chambers. An attendant, most likely. A small, anonymous act of care. It was still blooming. She sat with it for a long time. This branch that had refused to go dark through a public rejection, through a cold courtyard, through a king's long and uncomfortable reckoning with his own error. It had simply kept doing what it knew to be true, indifferent to the opinions of everyone in that hall. She thought about her mother, hemming a dress by lamplight the night before her daughter traveled to a ceremony everyone expected to mean nothing. The moon came through the window. She left the bough where the light could reach it. All right, she thought. Here is where we are.